For 30 years, The Tonight Show was the safest seat in television, smooth, controlled, and built entirely around Johnny Carson's timing. But every so often, that control disappeared the moment an animal walked through the curtain. No script, no rehearsal, no way to predict what would happen next. Handlers like Joan Embry and Jim Fowler turned Carson's desk into a makeshift zoo, and more than once, the king of late night found himself outmatched by a guest that couldn't read cue cards. Here are 15 of the wildest, funniest, and most nerve-wracking animal encounters Johnny Carson ever survived on live television. In the summer of 1983, Jim Fowler carried a black bear cub onto The Tonight Show stage, and Carson's body language gave him away instantly. He liked the idea of a baby bear far more than the reality standing a few feet from him. Fowler tried to reassure him that the cub was harmless, but Johnny kept his distance and peppered the segment with nervous one-liners that had the crowd laughing before the bear had even moved. It didn't take long for the cub to make its presence known. It wandered off toward the desk, sniffed around the set, and eventually found Ed McMahon's coffee cup and helped itself. Carson didn't miss a beat, cracking that the cub might hibernate for the rest of the year if it kept drinking Ed's coffee, a line that landed hard given how often Ed's drinking habits were already fair game on the show. Then Fowler pulled out a bottle, and the cub flopped onto its back, paws in the air, completely absorbed in its meal while Carson tried in vain to keep the conversation moving. Every time the bear shifted or climbed toward the desk, Johnny found a new joke, at one point comparing the moment to finding something unexpected in his soup. Nothing about the segment was dangerous, but the mix of Carson's caution and the cub's total obliviousness to the cameras made it one of the more oddly charming animal bits of the era. Joan Embry once brought a baby bison onto the show expecting a fairly gentle segment, and for a couple of minutes, that's exactly what it looked like. The calf swayed on its feet, flicked its tail, and generally seemed too restless to sit still, a preview of what was coming. Carson helped bottle feed the animal, and things stayed calm right up until the bottle started running dry. That's when the bison's patience ran out. It began shoving forward, straining against the bottle, and throwing its weight around with a strength that seemed impossible for something still classified as a baby. Even at that age, it had more than enough mass to push adults around the stage. Johnny found himself backpedaling while trying to keep the jokes coming, and every stumble backward got a bigger laugh from the crowd. Joan worked to keep the animal steady, but the bison had zero interest in cooperating. It wanted the bottle, and it wanted it now. The segment worked because of that contrast. Something that looked cuddly on camera turned out to have the raw power to shove a grown man off his mark, and watching Carson improvise through the chaos was a whole show. A sloth seemed like the one animal Carson genuinely had nothing to worry about. When Jim Fowler brought one out in 1985, the pitch was simple, slow-moving, sleepy, about as threatening as a houseplant. Compared to bears and reptiles, Johnny looked almost relaxed going into it. He even put on gloves as a precaution and let the sloth cling to his jacket while Fowler explained its habits. For a while, it played out exactly as advertised. The sloth barely moved, Johnny smiled for the cameras, and there was no sign of trouble. Then Carson noticed something was off. Those long claws weren't just resting on his jacket. They were slowly working their way through the fabric. His expression shifted from calm to visibly unsettled in the space of a few seconds. Fowler kept insisting everything was fine, and Johnny nodded along, but anyone watching closely could see he wasn't buying it. He stayed still, careful not to spook the animal, while quietly trying to figure out how to extract himself without a scene. The segment became a masterclass in physical comedy without a single dramatic moment. Just Carson's face doing all the work as a supposedly harmless animal slowly punctured his jacket. Not every animal guest was unpredictable chaos. Some came with an actual act. Zippy the chimpanzee, brought on by handler Jack Rinsky, walked out with the polish of a seasoned performer. He tied his own shoelaces, untied them, handled small props with real dexterity, and even worked a lighter with a level of coordination that startled the audience. What made Zippy memorable wasn't just the tricks, it was the timing. He seemed to know exactly when to pause for a laugh and when to move on to the next bit, almost like he understood he was performing for a crowd. Carson, smart enough to recognize a scene stealer when he saw one, didn't try to compete. He leaned back, tossed in quick reactions, and let Zippy run the segment. It turned into one of the cleanest, most purely entertaining animal spots the show ever produced, proof that sometimes the best way to handle an incredible guest is to just get out of the way. Fuzzy, cuddly animals were one thing, reptiles were an entirely different mood. When Jim Fowler brought out both an alligator and a crocodile in the summer of 1980, the temperature of the room changed instantly. The audience sat up straighter, and Carson's usual playful energy dropped into something closer to cautious respect. Fowler used the moment to explain the differences between the two animals, their habitats, their behavior, the subtle physical traits that told them apart. But most of the crowd wasn't there for the biology lesson. Every twitch of a tail or shift of a jaw sent a ripple of nervous laughter through the studio. Carson kept his distance for most of the segment, letting Fowler handle the animals directly while he leaned on humor to cover his obvious discomfort. His reactions did more work than his actual jokes. A raised eyebrow, a subtle step back, or exaggerated flinch every time one of the reptiles so much as blinked. Nothing wild actually happened, but the segment didn't need a big moment. Fowler's calm control paired against Carson's visible unease was enough to turn a straightforward wildlife demo into one of the more tense, funny animal segments in the show's history. Some animals were memorable for what they did. Waldo the water buffalo was memorable just for existing. Reportedly weighing close to a ton, Waldo was one of the single largest creatures ever wheeled onto the Tonight Show set, and the moment he lumbered into position, the entire tone of the segment changed. Carson stared at the animal like he genuinely couldn't process the size difference between them, and the crowd ate up every second of his reaction. Waldo stood there calmly enough, but with that much raw mass in the room, everyone understood that calm could change in an instant. Then came the part nobody in the audience expected. Johnny was talked into climbing onto Waldo's back. He agreed, but his face told a completely different story than his words. Once he was up there, every small shift of the buffalo's weight got a reaction from Carson and a laugh from the crowd. It wasn't a complicated stunt, but the sheer scale of the animal made it one of the more genuinely tense moments of physical comedy the show ever produced. When Joan Embery brought out a baby elephant, the audience's reaction was immediate affection. But affection didn't stop the elephant from being enormous and endlessly curious. Even as a baby, it had the size and strength to dominate the entire set just by moving through it. While Joan tried to share facts about the species, the elephant's trunk had other plans. It reached toward microphones, furniture, stage equipment, and eventually Johnny himself, treating every object within range as something worth investigating. Carson tried to keep the interview on track, but babysitting a trunk that could reach anywhere on set quickly became the real job. Unlike the smaller animals that handlers could scoop up and redirect, the elephant moved wherever its curiosity pointed, and Carson had no real way to predict it. The comedy came from the size mismatch. A baby animal already large enough to make a grown man look small, wandering the stage on its own agenda while Johnny reacted in real time. Nothing needed to go wrong for the segment to work. The elephant simply being itself was enough. Some of the smallest guests caused the biggest problems, and Howard the minor bird was a perfect example. Brought on by Joan Embery, Howard didn't look like much of a threat to the show's flow until he opened his beak. He greeted the audience, proudly introduced himself by name, then started mimicking sounds on command, including a convincing cat meow that got a genuine laugh out of the crowd. The real trouble started once Carson tried to actually run the interview. Every time Johnny began a sentence, Howard cut him off with a burst of laughter, timed with almost unbelievable precision, as if the bird understood exactly when a punchline was coming and wanted to beat him to it. Carson would try again, Howard would laugh louder, and the crowd loved every second of the standoff. Eventually Johnny stopped fighting it. He started tossing Howard grapes between attempts at conversation and let the bird's interruptions become the actual bit. By the end of the segment, a small tropical bird had done what few celebrity guests ever managed, completely hijacked one of the most controlled hosts in television history using nothing but his voice. In June of 1986, Joan Embery brought out 2 baby orangutans, and within seconds it was obvious Johnny Carson was no longer running the segment. The young apes arrived with boundless energy and zero interest in sitting still for an interview. The entire stage was suddenly their personal playground. One orangutan climbed straight up onto Carson's shoulders, and the audience roared as Johnny tried to keep his composure with an unexpected passenger draped over him. Meanwhile, the second orangutan went to work on everything else within reach, tugging at clothing, grabbing props, treating desk items and microphones like toys. Every attempt Carson made to steer the conversation got interrupted by another climb or grab, and keeping a straight face became a losing battle. Rather than fight it, he leaned into the chaos, firing off quick reactions and letting the orangutans dictate the pace. The total lack of control was exactly what made it work. The apes did whatever they wanted, and Johnny simply adapted in real time, turning it into one of the most beloved animal segments the show ever aired. One of the earliest animal moments to become a genuine Tonight Show legend involved Jim Fowler and a wild coyote. At first, everything went according to plan. Fowler calmly walked through the animal's behavior and habitat while Carson listened, visibly unconvinced that trusting a wild predator on live TV was a great idea. For a while, the coyote cooperated. Then it latched onto an object and simply refused to give it up. No amount of coaxing worked. The animal planted itself and wasn't moving. Carson's response became one of his sharpest ad-libs of the segment. He suggested Fowler just let the coyote keep whatever it wanted, a line that got a huge laugh purely because it sounded like completely reasonable advice in the moment. Then the segment topped itself. Mid-demonstration, the coyote relieved itself right there on the stage, and the studio lost it completely. Carson, Ed McMahon, and Fowler all struggled to keep their composure, and the unplanned nature of the moment made it funnier than anything a writer could have scripted. It remains one of the purest examples of live television going sideways in the best possible way. Joan Embry once introduced a young Przelsky's horse, one of the last truly wild horse breeds on Earth and a genuine conservation success story. It was meant to be an educational, feel-good segment. The horse had other ideas. From the second it stepped on stage, the animal made clear it wanted out. It pulled against its lead, tossed its head, and searched constantly for an exit while Joan tried to explain the breed's history. Every time handlers got it into position, it started moving again seconds later, and its stubbornness quickly became the whole joke. Carson watched from a safe distance, in no rush to get closer to an agitated horse, and leaned into jokes about its restless energy and obvious lack of interest in show business. What made the bit land wasn't chaos or danger. It was how relatable the horse's attitude felt. It simply wanted to leave, and its repeated, doomed attempts to do so gave Johnny an easy stream of material for the rest of the segment. In June of 1984, Joan Embry returned with a young gorilla that immediately proved it had zero interest in following anyone's script. Even at 18 months old, the animal carried real strength and confidence, and the moment it hit the stage, it was clear this wouldn't be a quiet interview. Joan tried to guide the segment, but the gorilla was far more interested in the set itself, furniture, equipment, and especially Carson drew its attention far more than standing still for